Robert, thanks for being with us here. I know you've been following this all day. I guess my first question to you is, we're almost 24 hours removed from this. We've been talking to people, they've told us it's not over by any means. So when the sun comes up, which it's going to do in a couple hours, what's next?
So it's a great question. So this is Israel's 9/11. That's been a characterization you've heard throughout the day, but it's very accurate. Percentage of population involved. And oh, by the way, we're not observers in this, we're participants. There are 200,000 American citizens in Israel. I would be shocked if among the wounded and among those killed, there weren't American citizens or dual citizens. But in terms of what is next, you can expect Israel to execute a rather well-coordinated and prepared for set-piece military operation into Gaza itself to accomplish what Prime Minister Netanyahu directed, which was the destruction of Hamas as a functioning military terrorist organization in Gaza City. Now, the one caveat I would say is that even though they prepared a tremendous amount of time in order to do this, years since they gave Gaza up, they know every centimeter of Gaza. There is, of course, the obvious fact that this attack occurred with a great degree of surprise, not unlike the Yom Kippur War, whose 50th anniversary we just celebrated. So clearly there's something wrong with the diagnosis and our ability and Israel's ability to understand and anticipate. So notwithstanding that potential deficiency, they're going to execute something they prepared for. That is going to be brutal. It is going to take a significant amount of time to do. And there's going to be a tremendous amount of visibility on this because everyone is a phone, everyone is connected, and this will play out in real time as it has today. And that is when the test and resolve of the United States and Israel's partners is really going to be brought to bear. And we'll all have to support Israel as they go through and execute the inevitable. Now, the real question there is whether this can be contained to Gaza City itself.
Right.
The challenge is that Hezbollah in Lebanon will be tempted and directed perhaps by Tehran, as Hamas undoubtedly was, to initiate operations. But it doesn't stop there. It could also be Quds Force attacks from Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And there are a range of terrorist infrastructure around the world that could be brought to play. So this could become regional. This could become global if we don't manage it correctly.
Okay. I want to put up this tweet here. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he's been on the phone with all of his kind of foreign counterparts there in the Middle East today. He spoke with Palestinian Authority President Abbas to discuss the terrorist attacks against Israel. I urge that all leaders in the region must condemn these appalling acts of terrorism, he says in that tweet there. Where is the Palestinian Authority in all this? I mean, where is Mahmoud Abbas? I mean, he can't necessarily call off Hamas here, but I was thinking, and a lot of people have made the argument that the two-state solution for this conflict has been dead for some time. I think it is quite buried in the ground now. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I would, and the fact of the matter is there's no one with whom Israel can negotiate. Certainly not Hamas. What they are, who they are, and what they do has been, I think, on full display today for those that weren't familiar. And Abbas certainly is not control, and he hasn't been for a long time, serving now, 16 years of his first four-year term. So you don't have a legitimate partner to negotiate with. At some point they may, but it's not today. I don't know that the calls to the Palestinian Authority do a lot of good. But I do think that it's going to be important to ensure the conflict doesn't escalate. So that has to be managed. And the United States is the one to do it. But let's be honest, like the United States has sort of allowed and dismantled deterrence fundamentally in the region, and for Israel specifically since it came into office. And that's got to change. We cannot indulge Iran, the sponsor, the proud corporate sponsorship for Hamas, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Tehran. We can't allow them access to resources. We can't transfer them additional resources. And we can't give them diplomatic cover. And no one in the region or anywhere could be more pro-Israel than the United States. And this has been the problem, I think, since 2021. And we're seeing these assumptions now crash and these internal contradictions and their policy approach are now starting to cave in.
Okay, so I just want to make sure we got some of these pictures, and you can hear the shelling, the strikes. You can see the Iron Dome system there over Gaza City. I want to talk as well. There's what I'm terming today the $6 billion question, because you've heard from a lot of, especially Republican critics of the Biden administration, who did not, want to see that prisoner swap deal take place with those 5 Iranian Americans who are now on U.S. soil. They opposed it quite greatly because of the fact that $6 billion of Iran's money was unfrozen, I believe, in a South Korean bank account. It's now in a Qatari bank account. And so many are saying that $6 billion, well, that was used to fund this most recent attack and incursion there. I want to put this tweet up here Sir, this is Adrienne Watson. She's the spokesperson for the National Security Council. She says this: I can't comment on 2024 because of the Hatch Act, but I can clarify the facts. Not a single cent from these funds has been spent, and when it is spent, it can only be spent on things like food and medicine for the Iranian people. So I think it's important to make that distinction, but some are saying, telling me it's a distinction without a difference.
It is. And it's also a strange thing to tweet on the United States when your partners incurred one of the most, if not the deadliest attack in its history. Probably not the thing that everyone needs to hear, but I understand why they're on the defensive, and they should be. The fact of the matter is, if you boil this down to the simplest terms, if you find $20 in your pocket and 2 days later you buy coffee, what $20 bill was used to pay for coffee really doesn't matter. And that's the point here if you really translate it down to the simplest possible terms. The reality is that $6 billion was frozen for a reason by successive administrations, including the Trump administration where I served. And it had to be transferred out of South Korean banks because they weren't willing to accept the risk that that would end up in terrorist hands, which it almost certainly was. So it went through Switzerland and now sits in Qatar. Whether or not, and I don't know that we know because we pulled our treasury attaché out of Doha just a few months ago, so we really can't discern with a great deal of certainty. But either way, Iran knew that it was getting $6 billion. But here's what's even more important, is that since the administration came in, they have been allowing Iran to export oil at record values to China for tremendous profit. And let me be specific. When we left office in January 21, Iran had $6 billion of accessible foreign exchange reserves left to them. And for context, that's the same amount that Haiti had. Now, you fast forward, they're somewhere north of $70 billion accessible foreign exchange. They're selling, when we left office, less than 400,000 barrels a day at about $55 a barrel, which was the market value when President Trump was in the office. Now you fast forward, they're selling 3.2 million barrels a day at about $85 a barrel is the going rate. Now that windfall of about $40+ billion since 21 is now completely accessible to Tehran, the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. So anyone who argues that the $6 billion in Doha is not providing material dividend to the Iranian people, I think has missed the plot.
All right, and we are getting to some more information, more news. And to your point about the Qataris, some are tweeting, Eli Lake, who writes for Bloomberg, is tweeting this: the Qataris should be given an ultimatum. Expel Hamas leaders from Doha or Israel will do it for you. Also, we're learning that Blinken did speak with the Qatari prime minister as well. I'm just reading his Twitter account. So to your point about regional spillovers, and we were somewhat on the precipice, the U.S. was in kind of brokering this Israeli-Saudi normalization deal. That also seems to be off the table, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and I think we could debate how close they were.
Okay. Sure.
You recall that we didn't discuss the Abraham Accords before they were concluded for good reason. I know that they had every incentive to say so, but the reality is that Congress was going to have a substantial say in enrichment and transfer of arms sales in any agreement that was substantive in nature between the United States and Saudi Arabia on security guarantees, and that requires a great deal of work that had not yet been conducted. Now, I think they were on the path, and they should have been since the accords were concluded. Certainly, we discussed it with them before we left office. And certainly, I would argue that this attack in some way was motivated by a desire to thwart that entirely and destroy Israel's relationship with its neighbors. But to your point on how much support and how much this could escalate, Qatar has, I think, motivated by a number of different factors, including successive U.S. administrations, to maintain a presence for Hamas so that negotiations could occur, and also with the Taliban, who established an office in Doha almost 10 years ago and maintains one there.
Right.
I've never thought it was a beneficial thing to do for the U.S. or for Qatar, to be quite honest, and I don't think it's sustainable now. Whether or not we approach them and state, as we did to Pakistan and others, that you could no longer harbor al-Qaeda after 9/11, I think we're in the same situation, and so I see Eli's point. I don't know that this administration is likely to pursue it, but I think we ought to.
Okay. I want to talk about the U.S. role, because to your point, I mean, what if U.S. citizens, dual citizens, Israeli Americans are among some of the fatalities and casualties here? Does that change the nature of our response?
Well, look, it is a sign, one of the nature of the closeness between the two countries. The fact that we have 200,000 American citizens in Israel reflects this proximity. The relationship between our two countries is unique. I think absolutely it should. When American blood is spilled, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to Israel for all kinds of reasons, but I think that makes it even more poignant and more critical for us to assume the proper role and support to the maximum extent possible in this situation. And if we don't, it's going to become a lot more costly for us in the longer term. So I think it absolutely does make a great difference.
To the point about the U.S. support, U.S. aid, also in this call with Bibi and Biden today, Netanyahu, apparently, according to sources to Axios, had asked for more funding and more aid for more interceptors for the Iron Dome missile defense system. And then also, I thought this was interesting as well, is the conventional wisdom forming amongst, U.S. officials, national security folks like yourself, that Israel was caught on their back foot here, that they were surprised by this. Mark Esper said this today to Neil Cavuto, that it caught the Israelis completely off guard. Now, you study this. I observe this very closely. The Israelis prepare for something like this 24/7, don't they?
They do. And that's what makes this all the more startling. And there are a couple of reasons you can get to it. And one, there's merit, I think, in discussing this to a certain extent because it does impact what happens next. But at the same time, I think it's most important to focus on what Israel has to do and how we can support them. But you're right in that this is their backyard for which they have been recognized as being dominant in it. And look, I think there are three possible reasons this occurred. The first is that the information was present, but it was misinterpreted or it was dismissed. It happens. There's a bias. Sometimes people fail even when the information doesn't. There are plenty of examples of this. The second is that the information itself wasn't available to begin with, that for whatever reason, Hamas and their masters in Tehran were able to obscure and prevent detection of a very complex orchestrated event that doubtless took months at a minimum in order to orchestrate. And that's a concerning issue for what happens going forward. It'll also require, I think, accountability and introspection on Israel's part, the kind that should have happened, frankly, after the disastrous withdrawal from Kabul, Afghanistan on the U.S. side, which never happened. I think this is a problem, and I think it's probably the third reason would be that we diverted assets, or Israel diverted assets. Both of us might have diverted assets to other priorities. And when that occurs, you can create blind spots. Okay. This one's a little bit too close.
Okay. I just want to take the 30,000-foot view here. I know we're still so early on in this, but on the global stage, what's happening? We got the war in Ukraine going on. We have tensions with China going on, and then now this. They're all interconnected in some way, are they not?
They absolutely are. At a minimum, it's weakness breeds aggression. And what we're seeing is the exploitation of it. Since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, not coincidentally, Putin 6 months later invades Ukraine for the second time. The first time he did it was when Biden was vice president under Obama, when he failed to enforce the Syrian red lines. And 6 months later, he invaded Ukraine. And I think China and others are looking at this and determining whether or not this is an opportune moment for them to seize the opportunity and exploit it for their advantage. And so there's no question that this is not coincidental. There's also economic motivations and factors included in all this that I think connect the parties. But the point really is that this is something that has to be contained, because if not, it is going to escalate and it's going to become unmanageable. And the costs of escalation are extremely high. Deterrence is difficult, but it's always more cost effective. Yeah.
Robert Greenway, we do appreciate your time, especially on this Saturday night, as we continue to monitor these developments. As still, this is all unfolding, as we speak. Hamas targets in Gaza are being shelled by the IDF at this very time, and still a barrage of missiles is incoming to parts of Israel. And so we'll just have to see how this plays out when the sun comes up. Sir, thanks so much.